At my sister's $150,000 wedding, I found my assigned seat outside the main ballroom right next to the kitchen trash cans. My sister smirked and told me I did not count. I took my gift, stood up, and walked out without a single word. Minutes later, she went pale and screamed, "My name is Nadia, and I am 32 years old." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic family exactly who they are dealing with. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, my parents were completely obsessed with maintaining an image of flawless Black excellence. They wanted our family to be the ultimate shining example for our megachurch and the exclusive country clubs they frequented. Every single aspect of our lives was carefully curated for public consumption and community approval. When I was 19 years old, my parents mapped out my entire future. They demanded that I finish my degree at Spelman College and immediately transition into a prestigious corporate law firm. But I had entirely different dreams. I wanted to truly understand the deep mechanics of generational wealth and not just the superficial appearance of it. So I made the difficult choice to drop out of college and start a small investment portfolio with money I had saved from working 3 part-time jobs. My mother Vivian was so deeply mortified by my decision that she told our entire church congregation I had suffered a severe mental breakdown. I was immediately cut off, financially disowned, and completely erased from the family narrative. I spent the next decade working 100-hour weeks, eating instant noodles, and sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor of a tiny studio apartment. While my younger sister Jasmine was being showered with designer handbags and luxury cars paid for by our parents, I was quietly building my company called Obsidian Capital. Today, my private equity firm manages billions of dollars in distressed debt. I spend my days dismantling failing corporations, restructuring bad commercial loans, and holding corrupt executives fully accountable for their actions. I became the very definition of independent wealth and power, but to my status-obsessed family, I was still just the disgraceful college dropout. When I received the invitation to Jasmine's lavish wedding, I almost threw it directly into the trash. But a small and foolish part of me hoped that time might have somehow healed our old wounds. I genuinely wanted to show up, be a supportive older sister, and perhaps enjoy a quiet evening with my family. I purchased a custom emerald green silk gown in Milan specifically for the occasion, as a private celebration of my own recent corporate acquisitions. The wedding venue was the Buckhead Grand Hotel, which is a towering monument to old money and Southern extravagance. My parents had spared absolutely no expense renting out the entire top floor for the reception. They wanted this event to be the ultimate showcase of their social climbing abilities. That fragile hope I carried died the second I stepped into the grand foyer. My mother Vivian intercepted me before I could even check my coat at the door. She grabbed my arm with her manicured nails digging sharply into my skin. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust and hissed that I looked like I was going to a cheap nightclub. She accused me of intentionally trying to ruin her perfect evening. I tried to pull away from her grip, but she tightened her hold, dragging me away from the beautiful double doors of the main ballroom and pushing me roughly down a dimly lit service corridor. She told me that her new son-in-law Brad had family flying in all the way from Boston. Brad was the white man my sister was marrying, and my parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. They genuinely believed that marrying into a wealthy white family from Massachusetts would somehow permanently elevate their own social status in Atlanta society. My mother pointed a trembling finger at my face and told me that I was a walking embarrassment. She said they could not risk a Spelman dropout, sitting at the main tables and interacting with wealthy trust fund heirs. She ordered me to stay completely out of sight and keep my mouth shut for the rest of the night. She forced me toward a wobbly metal folding chair that had been shoved into the dark corner of the hallway. It was positioned right next to the swinging kitchen doors. Every single time a waiter rushed past, the heavy scent of raw seafood and discarded appetizers washed over my face. Next to my sad little chair was a row of overflowing trash cans. I looked at my mother in total disbelief, but she simply turned on her designer heels and marched back to the glamour of the ballroom, leaving me sitting alone in the drafty corridor. I sat there for 20 minutes listening to the muffled sounds of live string quartets and clinking champagne glasses. Then the service door swung open, and my sister Jasmine walked out clinging tightly to Brad's arm. Jasmine was 28 years old, and the undisputed golden child of our family. She was obsessed with social media and desperate to project an image of effortless wealth and perfection. She wore a custom lace wedding gown that probably cost more than my first car. When she saw me sitting by the trash cans, a cruel smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. Jasmine stepped closer, looking down at me, as if I were a stranger begging for spare change. She told me that she had begged our mother to cross my name off the guest list entirely, but Vivian was too afraid of what the church ladies would whisper if her oldest daughter was missing from the family photos. Jasmine laughed a high-pitched sound and said that sitting next to the garbage was the exact perfect place for me. She told me to try not to let my scent ruin the atmosphere for her new wealthy in-laws. Brad stood next to her looking incredibly arrogant in his tailored tuxedo. He let out a condescending chuckle and told me to just keep my head down and let Jasmine have her perfect day. He looked at me with such immense superiority, fully believing the lie that he was a wealthy savior gracing our family with his presence. I did not cry or yell or cause a dramatic scene. Years of building a cutthroat private equity firm had taught me the extreme power of absolute composure. I simply stood up and smoothed out the wrinkles in my expensive silk gown. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a thick red envelope sealed with gold wax. Without saying a single word to either of them, I pushed past Brad and Jasmine and walked straight through the heavy double doors into the main ballroom. The room was blindingly bright, dripping in crystal chandeliers and thousands of imported white orchids. I ignored the confused stares of the affluent guests and walked directly to the sweetheart table at the front of the room. I placed the red envelope right in the center of Jasmine's gold-rimmed dinner plate. I took one last look at the extravagant room, turned on my heel, and walked out the front entrance of the hotel with my head held high. I walked out into the cool evening air where my driver was already pulling my Maybach around to the curb. Just as I reached for the car door handle, a piercing, hysterical scream echoed from inside the venue. It was Jasmine's voice, and it was so loud and full of pure terror that it stopped the live band completely dead in their tracks. I sat back into the plush leather passenger seat of my car, letting the heavy doors close and shut out the noise of the city. The serene, soundproof environment of the luxury vehicle was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was erupting inside the hotel ballroom. I calmly instructed my driver to keep the engine running and wait a moment because I knew my family would be coming for me very soon. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy glass front doors of the wedding venue burst wide open. My father Terrence and my new brother-in-law Brad sprinted out into the parking lot. Terrence was completely red in the face, with his veins popping out prominently against his neck. He looked absolutely frantic, scanning the brightly lit valet area until his angry eyes locked onto my vehicle. He ran up to the side of the car and began beating his fists violently against the tinted passenger window. I pressed the button to roll the window down just halfway, letting the cool night air and his enraged shouting fill the quiet cabin of the car. Terrence screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing aggressively across the concrete parking lot. He demanded to know if I was completely insane. He accused me of putting a fake bank foreclosure notice inside his precious daughter's wedding card, screaming that I was a jealous, bitter woman trying to intentionally ruin the most important day of Jasmine's entire life. I looked at my father with a level of cold, clinical detachment that seemed to momentarily confuse him. I kept my voice perfectly even and quiet, forcing him to stop his frantic screaming just to hear my words. I told him that the legal document inside the red envelope was absolutely not a fake notice. I explained clearly that the sprawling $2.5 million mansion that Brad had supposedly purchased for Jasmine as a wedding gift was nothing but a fragile house of cards. The property was heavily mortgaged, leveraged 3 times over its actual value, and had officially gone into severe default over 6 months ago. I watched the color slowly drain from Terrence's face as I delivered the final devastating blow. I informed him that my private equity firm, Obsidian Capital, had purchased that exact distressed debt portfolio directly from the bank yesterday morning. I explained that I was now the sole legal owner of that immense debt, and they had exactly 48 hours to pack their bags and vacate my property before the county sheriff arrived to physically remove them from the premises. Brad went completely pale, his arrogant country club demeanor evaporating in an instant. He started sweating profusely, pulling nervously at the tight collar of his expensive tuxedo shirt. He stammered out a pathetic and weak defense, claiming that his family trust fund was simply tied up in complex international investments and that the defaulted mortgage was just a minor temporary liquidity issue. He tried desperately to project confidence to my father, but his voice was trembling so badly he could barely form a complete coherent sentence. I cut him off sharply, refusing to let him spin another ridiculous lie in my presence. I looked Brad dead in the eye and systematically dismantled his entire fabricated identity right there in the valet parking lot. I told him that I knew his family was completely financially bankrupt. I explained that my firm had run a full forensic financial background check on him and his parents months ago. I revealed that his parents had absolutely zero liquid assets. Their three shell companies were currently under active federal investigation for massive tax evasion, and he had married my sister for one pathetic reason only. He genuinely thought my father was a gullible, status-obsessed mark who would blindly fund his lavish lifestyle to keep up appearances. Terrence grabbed the window frame of my car, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of sheer panic and furious denial. He absolutely refused to believe that his perfect white son-in-law was a complete fraud. He screamed that I was lying out of spite, insisting that Brad was bringing generational wealth to our family name. Then, in a moment of desperate, blinding rage, my father confessed his own devastating financial secret. He yelled that he had drained his entire retirement savings account to pay for this extravagant $150,000 wedding because Brad's family money was supposedly temporarily frozen by the banks. I stared at my father as a profound sense of disgust washed over my entire body. He had spent his entire life preaching to me about strict financial responsibility, only to throw it all away for the cheap illusion of high society status. But my deep disgust quickly turned to absolute fury as I realized the darker truth behind his angry confession. I knew his financial situation better than he realized, and I knew he did not have that kind of money sitting in his personal retirement accounts. I leaned closer to the open window and told him that I knew exactly where that wedding money actually came from. I exposed his lie, stating that he had not drained his retirement at all. Instead, he had illegally withdrawn the funds from the generational inheritance trust that Big Mama, my grandmother, had left behind for the entire family. He had selfishly drained the family trust just to fund a ridiculous, flashy illusion for his golden child, sacrificing our real family wealth simply to impress a group of wealthy strangers at a country club. Before Terrence could even open his mouth to scream another defensive insult or deny my serious accusation, the piercing wail of police sirens filled the dark night sky. 3 Atlanta police cruisers tore through the venue entrance, their red and blue emergency lights flashing violently and casting harsh, bright shadows across the parking lot. The police vehicles screeched to a sudden halt, completely blocking the exit ramp and surrounding our position. 4 heavily armed police officers jumped out of their cruisers, moving with intense purpose. They did not even glance in my direction or speak to my father. They marched straight past my car, walking directly up to where Brad was standing, frozen in fear. One tall officer grabbed Brad by the silk lapels of his tuxedo, spinning him around forcefully and slamming him hard against the hood of my Maybach. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly in the quiet night air. The arresting officer announced in a loud, clear voice that Bradford Miller was under arrest for interstate wire fraud and bank deception. I rolled my window up tight, sealing out my father's panicked screaming and Brad's pathetic sobbing. As my driver slowly navigated around the parked police cruisers and pulled out onto the main road, I looked back in the rearview mirror. The perfect high society wedding, the fake generational wealth, and my parents' desperate illusion of superiority were all burning to the ground exactly as they deserved. 4 days later, my phone rang. My mother, Vivian, was on the other end, using her sweetest, manipulative church voice. She insisted I attend our traditional Sunday dinner after the morning church service. She claimed the family needed to heal after the wedding. I knew exactly what this was. Sunday dinner was never just about passing the cornbread. It was a courtroom where my parents served as judge and jury, and I was the defendant. I agreed to go because I wanted to look them in the eye when I delivered my next lesson. I arrived at their sprawling Buckhead estate wearing a sharp, tailored designer pantsuit. The moment I stepped into the formal dining room, the tension was palpable. My father, Terrence, sat at the head of the mahogany table. Brad was sitting right next to him, casually eating a piece of fried chicken. Terrence had actually drained more of our family resources to post Brad's federal bail. Jasmine sat across from her new husband, wearing a designer silk blouse and clutching a tissue like a grieving widow. Before I could unfold my napkin, my mother slid a thick legal document across the table. It stopped in front of my plate. I glanced down and clearly saw it was a legal quitclaim deed. Vivian crossed her arms, staring at me with venom. She demanded I sign the legal deed immediately and transfer the million-dollar debt of Jasmine's mansion back into my name, taking the financial burden off Brad's shoulders. She called it a necessary wedding apology for the spectacle I caused with the police. I looked at the document and then at my father. I asked him if he honestly thought a piece of paper could erase federal wire fraud. Terrence slammed his fist on the table, rattling the water glasses. He yelled that I was a bitter, spiteful woman, actively trying to destroy Black excellence by tearing down my own sister. He insisted Brad's arrest was a minor corporate misunderstanding and the Boston Trust Fund would clear everything up next month. He ordered me to sign the paper and fix the mess. Jasmine began producing crocodile tears, wiping her eyes dramatically. She looked at me with total disgust and accused me of being insanely jealous. She cried out that I was a miserable dropout who could not handle the fact that she had secured a perfect, wealthy white husband. She claimed I was using my debt collection business to punish her for achieving the fairy tale. I could never get. Brad sat back in his chair, licking grease off his fingers with a smug grin. His posture screamed absolute confidence. He genuinely believed the intense pressure of my traditional family would force me to cave, just like it did when I was a teenager. He thought I would sacrifice my sanity to keep the peace. I did not touch the pen. Instead, I picked up my phone and tapped the screen. I quietly accessed the dining room's central Bluetooth sound system, which Terrence installed last year to play gospel music during his sophisticated gatherings. I looked directly at Brad and told him his biggest mistake was assuming a Spelman dropout, did not know how to run a proper forensic background check. I pressed play on my phone. Brad's own voice blasted through the surround sound speakers echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The audio was crystal clear. It was a recorded phone call from 2 weeks ago between Brad and his cousin back in Massachusetts. Everyone at the table froze. He was laughing mockingly on the recording, calling my parents a bunch of gullible Atlanta snobs. He boasted about how incredibly easy it was to manipulate them. He bragged that this family was so desperate for a white son-in-law to parade around their country club that he could bleed them dry in a year. He stated that once he drained Terrence's accounts to pay off his massive gambling debts, he would dump Jasmine and disappear. The silence in the dining room was deafening. The recording stopped and the only sound was the air conditioning. Brad turned the color of chalk, dropping his chicken onto his plate. Jasmine stared at her new husband with her mouth wide open, her fake tears instantly drying up. I looked at my mother expecting to see the devastating realization of the truth wash over her face. I expected her to see that I was protecting them from a monster. Instead, Vivian lunged out of her chair. She reached across the corner of the table and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the room. My cheek burned, but I did not flinch. Vivian screamed at the top of her lungs, accusing me of faking the audio. She shrieked that I was a demonic force trying to poison her perfect family, because I was miserable and alone. She refused to accept the reality that she had sold her soul and her daughter's future for a complete lie. Just as she raised her hand to strike me a second time, the heavy brass doorbell rang, echoing through the massive house. Nobody moved. The maid hurried down the hall to answer the front door. We heard a brief commotion in the grand foyer, and then a woman pushed past the maid and marched straight into the formal dining room. She was a blonde white woman wearing sweatpants and looking absolutely exhausted. In her arms, she was holding a crying 6-month-old baby. The woman stopped at the edge of the Persian rug and glared at Brad with pure, unfiltered hatred. She ignored my parents, keeping her furious eyes completely locked onto the man sitting next to my father. She raised her voice over her crying infant and delivered a sentence that shattered the room completely. "You said you were in Atlanta for a business trip, not a wedding." The dining room erupted into absolute chaos the second those words left her mouth. Jasmine let out a guttural shriek and threw her sweet tea across the table. The glass shattered against the mahogany wood, sending ice and brown liquid flying everywhere. Brad leaped up, backing away from the woman and infant as if they carried a plague. He held his hands up, stammering pathetic excuses about a massive misunderstanding. The woman shifted the baby, pulling a crumpled marriage certificate from her diaper bag and slamming it down on the soggy fried chicken. She introduced herself as Megan and informed the room she and Brad had been legally married in Massachusetts for 4 years. Jasmine collapsed onto the floor, weeping hysterically into her silk blouse. She screamed her perfect fairy tale was completely ruined and her life was over. But the truly sickening part of the afternoon was not Brad's betrayal. The truly sickening part was watching my parents react to the news. Vivian did not rush to comfort her golden child sobbing on the rug. Terrence did not throw the con man out of his house for manipulating his daughter. Instead, my mother scrambled to her feet and rushed over to Megan. Vivian pulled out her checkbook with trembling hands, desperate to salvage her social standing. My mother begged this exhausted, betrayed woman to take $50,000 and quietly walk out the front door. Vivian whispered frantically that they were prominent country club members and could not possibly afford a public scandal. She told Megan to go back to Boston and pretend this nightmare never happened. Megan stared at my mother in complete disgust, slapping the checkbook out of Vivian's hands. The leather booklet hit the floor with a heavy thud, skidding under the dining chair. Megan yelled that no amount of dirty money could buy her silence. She swore she was going straight to the police to report Brad for bigamy and fraud. As Megan stormed out carrying her crying child, the heavy oak front door slammed shut. The loud noise echoed like a gunshot through the estate. The pristine illusion of black excellence they had meticulously built was completely shattered. But rather than face the harsh reality, Terrence turned his furious, bloodshot eyes directly on me. He marched around the table, pointing a shaking finger an inch from my face. He yelled that I purposely brought this woman here to ruin our family legacy. He screamed that I was a jealous, bitter dropout who could not stand to see my sister secure a wealthy white husband. He aggressively accused me of hiring an actress to destroy their social standing because I was miserable and alone. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect us and felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical detachment. I did not raise my voice in anger, and I did not shed a single emotional tear. I simply looked down at the forged quitclaim deed they had tried to force me to sign just minutes earlier. I looked Terrence dead in the eye and calmly broke down the exact timeline of his sheer stupidity. I told him that while he was busy calling me a complete failure for building my own business, Brad was busy draining their bank accounts dry. I explained that exactly 24 months ago, Brad targeted Jasmine at a charity gala specifically because she was wearing a $40,000 diamond necklace. I detailed how Brad convinced Terrence to invest $200,000 into a fake real estate venture back in Boston, a lucrative venture that never existed. I listed every single wire transfer my father made to Brad's offshore accounts, while simultaneously refusing to co-sign a small business loan for my first startup company. I laid out the cold, hard facts proving that Brad used my father's hard-earned money to pay off his Massachusetts mortgage and buy a brand new luxury vehicle for his secret wife. I told them they were so blinded by their desperate need for white validation that they handed the keys to their kingdom to a common criminal. I reminded Vivian how she bragged to the entire church congregation about her daughter's elite marriage, while ignoring the glaring fact that Brad never once introduced Jasmine to a single member of his actual family. I pointed out that his supposed trust fund was nothing but a cheap prop used to keep them hooked on the promise of generational wealth that would never materialize. Jasmine continued sobbing loudly on the floor, tightly clutching the wooden legs of the dining table, but my parents stood completely frozen in place. The brutal truth was finally staring them right in the face, stripping away every last ounce of their manufactured dignity and foolish pride. But Terrence was a man completely consumed by his own immense arrogance and the dangerous sunk cost fallacy. Instead of apologizing to his daughters or calling the authorities, he simply adjusted his tailored suit jacket and lifted his chin. He looked down at me with a sickeningly smug expression that made my blood run entirely cold. He confidently declared that it does not matter what I do or what I think I know about his private finances. He proudly announced that he had already fixed the situation behind the scenes without my knowledge. He admitted with zero remorse that he used Big Mama's trust fund to clear Brad's other local debts just yesterday afternoon. He told me that they were going to save this marriage no matter what it took to protect their flawless public image. He insisted that Brad was going to legally divorce that woman in Boston, and they would simply pay off the local judge to keep the scandal permanently sealed. He smiled arrogantly, fully believing he had outsmarted me and won the ultimate victory. I froze completely still, quietly absorbing the absolute magnitude of his terrifying confession. Then a terrifying predatory smile spread slowly across my face. My predatory smile slowly faded into a mask of pure, absolute calculation. Terrence stood at the head of the ruined dining table with his chest puffed out. He honestly believed his confession was a checkmate. He genuinely thought that stealing from his own family to protect a con artist was a display of ultimate patriarchal power. He looked at me, expecting me to crumble into defeat, because he controlled the purse strings of our family legacy. I asked him to repeat what he just said so there was absolutely no misunderstanding. Terrence scoffed and crossed his arms over his tailored vest. He loudly proclaimed that he was the sole executor of Big Mama's estate. He boasted that he had every legal right to distribute the trust funds however he saw fit to maintain the pristine reputation of this family. He yelled that protecting Jasmine's marriage from a financial hiccup was his duty, and I had no power to question his authority. I let his booming voice echo off the crystal chandelier before I finally stood up from my chair. I walked slowly around the mahogany table, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I stopped right behind Brad's chair, looking directly at my father. I asked Terrence if he remembered the night he threw me out of this exact house 10 long years ago. I reminded him how he screamed at me for turning down a full ride to law school because I wanted to pursue private equity. I reminded him how he packed my belongings in trash bags and left them on the porch. He told me that night I was a disgrace to our bloodline and would never see a single dime of the family money. Terrence smirked and said he remembered it perfectly. He said it was the best thing he ever did because it taught me a harsh lesson about disrespecting his authority. I nodded slowly. I told him he was right about one thing. That night changed everything. But I asked him if he remembered who came to pick me up from the curb. Terrence's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Big Mama came to get me. I lived with her for 2 years while I built my first portfolio. Jasmine whined from the floor, complaining that nobody cared about my ancient history with our grandmother. She demanded that Terrence write another check to fix her life right now. I ignored my crying sister and pulled a sleek black tablet from my designer tote bag. I looked at my father and delivered the reality check that would end his entire reign of terror. I told him that while I was living with Big Mama, she watched everything. She watched how Terrence spent his money on flashy cars, country club memberships, and useless status symbols. She watched him spoil Jasmine rotten while treating me like an unwanted stray. And she realized that if she left her generational wealth in his hands, he would burn it to the ground, trying to impress people who secretly despised him. Terrence demanded to know what I was talking about. His voice cracked, losing its booming authority. I tapped the screen of my tablet, waking it up. I told him that 9 years ago, Big Mama quietly called her attorney. She completely restructured the family trust. She removed Terrence as the primary executor and stripped him of all financial control. She legally appointed me as the sole executor and primary guardian of the entire estate. I told my father that he had not been the legal executor of anything for nearly a decade. Vivian gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands. She looked at Terrence in sheer horror. Terrence stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the sideboard. He aggressively pointed his finger at me, shouting that I was a liar. He yelled that he had been accessing the trust accounts for years without any issues. I smiled again. A cold, calculating smile that made Brad physically shrink in his seat. I explained to Terrence that as the legal executor, I allowed him to maintain access to a small subsidiary account. I let him keep his illusion of control because it kept him away from the primary assets. I gave him just enough rope to hang himself and he just sprinted to the gallows. I walked back to my seat and picked up my purse. I told Terrence that what he'd just confessed to the room was not a simple family transaction. By draining the trust to pay off Brad's massive Massachusetts gambling debts and underwater mortgages, he had committed federal wire fraud. Furthermore, because the stolen money legally belonged to a trust governed by my private equity firm, he had just confessed to embezzling millions of dollars directly from Obsidian Capital. Jasmine finally stopped crying and stared at our father in absolute shock. The realization of his crime washed over the room. Terrence began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest. He stammered that it was a mistake and he could easily put the money back. He pleaded that we were family and I could not possibly pursue legal action against my own flesh and blood. I reminded him that he was the one who said blood did not matter when I refused to go to law school. I quietly tapped a single button on my tablet screen. It was a direct command to my legal department, overriding all of his banking authorizations. Seconds later, Terrence's phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He scrambled to pull it out, his hands shaking uncontrollably. It was an automated alert from his primary bank. Then another alert came through, and another. His country club escrow account, his business lines of credit, and his personal savings accounts all showed a zero available balance. The screen flashed a bright red notification stating his assets were legally frozen by the Compliance Division of Obsidian Capital. Monday morning arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of an Atlanta summer, but the air inside the penthouse conference room was freezing cold. I sat completely alone at the end of a glass table wearing a charcoal suit, waiting for the storm I knew was coming. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doors swung open. Terrence marched in first, looking like a man who had spent the entire weekend desperately trying to glue his shattered ego back together. He was flanked by Vivian, who was clutching a handbag like a life preserver. Right behind them were Jasmine and Brad, followed closely by Brad's parents, Charles and Patricia. Charles carried himself with New England arrogance, acting as if stepping foot in the South was a massive inconvenience to his day. They brought an army with them. 4 high-priced corporate litigators in expensive navy suits fanned out across the room, placing thick leather briefcases on the table with synchronized, intimidating thuds. They intended to overwhelm me with sheer numbers and aggressive legal posturing. Terrence glared at me across the room. He demanded that I immediately unfreeze his financial accounts and relinquish control of the family trust, or his legal team would bury me under so many lawsuits I would never see daylight again. Vivian stood right next to Charles, nodding in furious agreement with her wealthy white in-laws. She crossed her arms and loudly declared that she was deeply embarrassed to have given birth to a daughter who would maliciously attack her own flesh and blood just to ruin a high society wedding. She apologized profusely to Charles and Patricia, claiming that I had always been severely troubled and completely incapable of understanding the sophisticated complexities of generational wealth. Charles did not even bother to look at me when he spoke. He addressed his lead attorney while gesturing vaguely in my direction with a dismissive wave of his hand. He laughed, a dry, mocking sound, and called me an angry little girl playing with adult money. He told his lawyer to draft up whatever injunctions were necessary to force me to surrender the deeds and the trust funds. He claimed my temper tantrum was disrupting his son's honeymoon plans, and he wanted this ridiculous ghetto drama concluded by lunchtime so he could catch his private flight back to Boston. Brad sat next to his father, leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair with a sickeningly smug grin returning to his face. Having his wealthy white parents in the room suddenly gave him back his false bravado. He told me I was completely out of my league. He insisted that a Spelman dropout could never outsmart a team of Harvard-educated attorneys. He demanded I sign the property transfers immediately, and maybe they would be generous enough to not press extortion charges against me. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I did not display a single ounce of the emotional instability they desperately wanted to see. I sat in total silence, allowing their insults and racist microaggressions to hang heavily in the chilled air of the boardroom. The lead attorney cleared his throat and slid a massive stack of cease and desist orders across the glass table. He demanded my signature, threatening me with immediate financial ruin if I refused to comply. I looked down at their threatening paperwork and simply pushed it off the edge of the table. The documents scattered across the expensive carpet. Charles slammed his hand on the table, yelling that my childish behavior was exactly why I was unfit to manage a single dollar of real capital. I reached down into my own leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy-bound document. It was a 500-page forensic financial audit compiled by my top-tier compliance team at Obsidian Capital. I slid the massive binder across the long glass table. It stopped precisely in front of Charles. I finally spoke. Keeping my tone chillingly flat and absolutely devoid of any mercy, I told Charles that he was absolutely right about one thing. I was definitely playing with adult money. I instructed his team of Harvard-educated lawyers to open the binder to page 47 and read the highlighted paragraphs out loud to the room. The lead attorney scoffed, but opened the heavy binder. His eyes scanned the page, and his arrogant posture completely collapsed. The color rapidly drained from his face as he hastily flipped to the next page and then the next. He looked up at Charles with absolute sheer panic in his eyes. Charles demanded to know what was in the file. I leaned forward and delivered the killing blow. I informed the entire room that the comprehensive audit proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Charles and Patricia were currently under an active federal investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. I laid out the exact details of their massive fraud. I explained that their supposedly prestigious Boston real estate empire was nothing but a sophisticated Ponzi scheme built on decades of blatant tax evasion and phantom shell companies. I told them I knew their accounts were already flagged for federal seizure, which was the real reason they desperately needed Terrence to fund Brad's lavish lifestyle. Vivian gasped loudly, turning to Patricia, who was suddenly trembling violently in her expensive cashmere sweater. Terrence demanded to know what this Boston tax fraud had to do with his frozen bank accounts in Atlanta. I turned my gaze directly to my father, feeling profound disgust for the man who sold his daughter out. I told Terrence to turn to page 112. I revealed the terrifying truth that Charles had been using Terrence as an unwitting financial mule. I exposed the undeniable fact that dirty money from the Boston tax evasion scheme was being systematically funneled directly through the charity outreach fund of his own megachurch. The lead attorney did not say a single word at first. He simply closed the massive, heavy binder and pushed it back across the glass table. He looked at Charles with an expression of pure professional terror. He calmly instructed his legal team to pack up their documents immediately. Charles demanded to know where they were going, yelling that he paid them a 7-figure retainer to handle this mess. The lead attorney firmly stated that his firm does not represent clients actively engaging in federal tax evasion and money laundering. He explained that staying in this room for even one more minute would make them accessories to a federal crime. Without looking back, the 4 expensive corporate litigators marched straight out of the penthouse conference room, leaving Brad and his parents completely defenseless against my audit. The silence that followed their departure was absolutely deafening. The arrogant, untouchable facade of the Boston elite completely shattered into pieces. Charles turned violently toward my father, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. All of his polite high society manners vanished in an instant, replaced by the raw, vicious racism he had been hiding behind his checkbook. Charles pointed a shaking finger at Terence and screamed that this was all a setup. He yelled that this desperate status-obsessed Atlanta family had intentionally trapped his innocent son. Patricia chimed in, her voice shrill and panicked, claiming that she always knew we were just trying to steal their good Boston name to elevate our own pathetic social standing. She accused my father of dragging their perfect family into his corrupt church charity schemes. Terence was completely cornered. The reality of a federal prison sentence was staring him right in the face. He tried to puff out his chest and yell back at Charles, but his voice cracked in sheer terror. He knew that the paper trail in my audit was absolutely flawless. Vivian stood next to him, shaking so violently that her diamond bracelets rattled against each other. My mother was terrified of losing her country club status, but she was even more terrified of wearing a prison jumpsuit. She looked at Charles and Patricia, and then made the most ruthless, cold-blooded decision I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Vivian screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing her manicured finger directly at her golden child. She yelled that Terence was completely innocent and had absolutely nothing to do with the fraudulent loan documents. My mother desperately blurted out that Jasmine was the one who signed every single piece of paperwork for Brad's shell companies. Vivian threw her own daughter completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. She loudly confessed to the room that Jasmine was the sole legal guarantor on all the commercial loans, and therefore Jasmine was the only one legally responsible for the millions of dollars in stolen funds. The entire room froze. Jasmine stopped crying, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly turned her head to look at the woman who had spent the last 28 years treating her like an absolute princess. The profound horror washing over Jasmine's face was almost difficult to watch. She finally realized the terrifying truth about our parents. Vivian and Terence did not actually love her. They only loved the flawless image she provided for them. And the very second that perfect image threatened their own survival, they tossed her directly into the federal fire to save their own skins. Jasmine looked desperately at Brad, praying her husband would step in and defend her. But Brad just stared down at the expensive conference room carpet, refusing to make eye contact. He knew Vivian was right. He had purposely manipulated his naive, desperate wife into signing her name on every single fraudulent corporate document, thereby shielding himself and his parents from direct federal liability. Jasmine was left holding the bag for a multi-million-dollar financial conspiracy, and her own mother had just happily served her up to the authorities to protect my father's country club membership. Jasmine began to hyperventilate. The crushing weight of massive federal charges and millions of dollars in insurmountable debt came crashing down on her shoulders. She looked around the cold glass conference room, realizing that every single person she had ever trusted had completely betrayed her. Her husband was a con artist, her in-laws were racist criminals, and her parents were willing to let her rot in a federal penitentiary just to save face. Then Jasmine's panicked eyes slowly locked onto me. I sat at the end of the long glass table, completely untouched by the chaos, perfectly calm, and holding the only copy of the forensic audit that could destroy all of their lives. I was the college dropout they had banished to the hallway next to the kitchen trash cans just a few days ago. Now I was the only person in the entire world with the power and the capital to save her from complete annihilation. Jasmine let out a devastating, heartbreaking sob. She stumbled forward, her knees giving out from underneath her. She dropped completely to the floor right in the middle of the corporate boardroom. She crawled across the expensive carpet tears streaming down her ruined makeup until she reached my chair. The golden child of the family grabbed the fabric of my designer skirt, sobbing uncontrollably. I looked down at her hands, desperately clutching my clothes. This was the exact same woman who had laughed condescendingly when I was ordered to leave the main ballroom of her extravagant wedding. She had spent her entire existence blindly following our mother's toxic playbook, believing that her light skin and her wealthy white husband made her inherently superior to me. She had mocked my long hours, my relentless ambition, and my decision to build my own private equity firm from the ground up. Now the harsh, brutal reality of the real world had shattered her fragile fantasy completely. She was begging a Spellman dropout to protect her from the devastating consequences of her own blinding vanity. Vivian shouted at Jasmine to get up off the floor, demanding that she stop embarrassing the family in front of Charles and Patricia. Even in the face of federal indictments, my mother was still entirely consumed by how her daughter's actions appeared to wealthy white people. But Jasmine did not listen to Vivian anymore. She tightened her grip on my skirt completely, ignoring our mother's frantic commands. Jasmine wept loudly, pleading with me to use my wealth and my legal team to protect her from going to prison. She told me she was terrified and admitted that she had been a complete fool. The entire room fell dead silent as everyone waited to see exactly how I would respond to the sister who had treated me like garbage her entire life. I quietly looked down at the top of Jasmine's perfectly styled head as she loudly sobbed into the fabric of my designer skirt. Her manicured fingers gripped the material with absolute desperation, staining the silk with her expensive foundation and mascara. The golden child of our family was utterly broken, completely shattered by the realization that her fairy tale marriage was nothing but a federal crime scene. I did not pull away from her grasp, but I also did not offer her a warm, comforting embrace. I simply stood there as a monument of the very success she had mocked her entire life. I told Jasmine to stop crying and stand up. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, slicing through her hysterical sobs like a freshly sharpened blade. I informed her that I could easily have my legal team completely untangle her from Brad's fraudulent corporate loans. I explained that Obsidian Capital had the resources to legally isolate her signature and prove she signed those documents under extreme duress and deliberate manipulation. I watched a flicker of profound hope ignite in her bloodshot eyes. She scrambled to her feet, nodding frantically and thanking me repeatedly. But I raised my hand and stopped her pathetic gratitude. I told her my protection came with strict, non-negotiable terms. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a separate folder containing a deeply comprehensive legal confession. I slid the thick document across the glass table right next to the massive forensic audit. I demanded that Jasmine sign the confession immediately. I explained that the document fully detailed every single one of Brad's illegal activities and explicitly admitted that our parents knew about the stolen funds. Furthermore, I demanded that she hand over her unlocked phone and provide every single password to her highly curated social media accounts. I told her I was taking complete control of her public narrative to ensure she could never again use her fake, flawless image to weaponize our family name against me. Vivian shrieked from the other side of the boardroom. My mother lunged forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She grabbed Jasmine's arm and yanked her away from the glass table. Vivian screamed that Jasmine could not possibly sign that confession because it would permanently destroy our family reputation at the country club and humiliate them in front of the entire church congregation. She demanded absolute family loyalty, insisting that they needed to present a united front to protect Terrence from going to federal prison. She ordered Jasmine to act like a dutiful daughter and sacrifice her own freedom to save their pristine Atlanta legacy. For the first time in 28 years, Jasmine did not immediately bow her head and blindly obey our mother. The sheer terror of facing federal prison had finally snapped the toxic umbilical cord connecting them. Jasmine violently yanked her arm out of Vivian's tight grip. She glared at our mother with a level of raw, visceral hatred I had never seen before. Jasmine screamed right back at Vivian, asking what family loyalty actually meant to a mother who literally just tried to sacrifice her own child to the authorities. She yelled that she was suffocating under the crushing weight of Vivian's impossible expectations. Jasmine laid her entire truth bare, crying out that she only married Brad because Vivian relentlessly pushed her to secure a wealthy white husband to elevate their social standing. She told our mother that she was absolutely sick and tired of being used as a beautiful silent prop for Vivian's ridiculous vanity projects. She declared that she would rather lose her fake country club friends than spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal penitentiary just to protect a father who stole from his own family. Vivian stood completely frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The perfectly constructed illusion of her maternal superiority had been violently ripped to shreds by her favorite child. Jasmine turned her back on our stunned mother and marched directly up to the glass table. Her hands were shaking violently, but her sudden resolve was completely unbroken. She picked up the heavy gold pen resting next to the confession document. Without hesitating for another second, she aggressively signed her name on every single page, finalizing her complete defection from our parents' toxic regime. She then unlocked her smartphone and slammed it down onto the glass surface right on top of the signed legal papers. She provided every password I demanded fully, surrendering her precious social media empire into my total control. I calmly collected the signed legal confession and her fully unlocked device, securing them safely inside my designer leather briefcase. I looked directly at Brad, who was sweating profusely in his chair. Perfectly aware that his own wife had just provided the federal government with the exact ammunition needed to lock him away for many long decades. I then turned my immediate attention to Terrence and Vivian, who were staring at me with twisted expressions of pure, unparalleled terror. They finally realized that their discarded college dropout daughter now held absolute power over their freedom, their finances, and their entire social existence. I zipped my heavy briefcase shut and slowly picked it up by the reinforced leather handle. I looked directly at my terrified parents and delivered my final devastating ultimatum. I kept my steady voice incredibly calm, ensuring every single word struck them with absolute lethal precision. I told them they had exactly 72 hours before my massive legal team unsealed the forensic audit and officially handed it over to the waiting federal authorities. I let that terrifying deadline hang heavily in the cold air of the silent boardroom. I smiled a brief, chilling smile. I told them to enjoy the lavish annual Black Excellence Gala on Friday night. Then I turned around and walked confidently out of the room, leaving them to choke on their own inevitable destruction. 48 hours later, the suffocating heat of an Atlanta Friday afternoon pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the most exclusive salon in Buckhead. Vivian sat in the plush leather VIP chair, staring at her own reflection in the brightly lit vanity mirror. Her hands were trembling so violently that she dropped a tube of expensive red lipstick onto the marble counter. It rolled off and hit the floor, but she did not bend down to pick it up. She aggressively dabbed thick layers of designer concealer under her eyes, desperately trying to erase the dark, bruised circles of pure, sleepless terror that had settled on her face over the past 2 days. Her wealthy friends, the powerful wives of mega-church pastors and prominent local politicians, were sitting in the adjacent chairs, sipping complimentary champagne. One of them leaned over and asked about the nasty rumors circulating regarding Jasmine's wedding reception and the sudden police presence. Vivian did not even blink. She seamlessly slipped into her practiced mask of absolute delusion. She laughed a high-pitched, dismissive sound and loudly proclaimed that her oldest daughter Nadia was simply going through another one of her bitter phases. Vivian confidently lied to the entire room, claiming that Nadia was always inherently jealous of her younger sister. Because Jasmine had secured such a flawless marriage, Vivian doubled down on her ridiculous fantasy, telling her friends that Brad was a perfect gentleman from an elite Boston family. She completely fabricated a story about a minor misunderstanding with the valet service to explain away the police cars. She then shifted the conversation seamlessly, reminding everyone to bring their checkbooks to the annual Black Excellence Charity Gala that evening. She boasted that Terrence was preparing to launch their biggest community outreach fund, yet masking her mounting panic behind a wall of arrogant pride. Miles away inside the sprawling family mansion, Terrence was not bothering with makeup. He was in his dark wood-paneled study, sweating completely through his custom-tailored tuxedo shirt. He frantically shoved stacks of financial ledgers, offshore banking tokens, and bound stacks of physical $100 bills into a heavy leather duffel bag. Brad paced back and forth across the Persian rug, biting his fingernails down to the quick. Terrence slammed the duffel bag shut and grabbed Brad by the lapels of his suit, driving him back against the mahogany bookshelf. Terrence hissed that the plan was set in stone. They were going to host the gala tonight. collect over $1 million in silent auction bids and direct charity donations, and immediately wire every single cent into an untraceable Cayman Islands account. Terrence swore that by the time the federal authorities unsealed Nadia's audit on Monday morning, they would already be on a private jet to a country with absolutely no extradition laws. Brad nodded frantically, his arrogant Boston air persona completely shattered. He whined that Jasmine was becoming a liability. Terrence shoved him away in disgust, ordering him to keep his mouth shut and smile for the cameras. Upstairs, Vivian marched into Jasmine's old childhood bedroom. Jasmine was curled into a tight ball on the mattress, staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic, after realizing her entire life was a federal crime. Vivian roughly grabbed her golden child by the arm, dragging her off the bed. She threw a shimmering gold designer gown at Jasmine's chest. Vivian coldly ordered her daughter to put the dress on, fix her ruined face, and smile perfectly for the donors. She warned Jasmine that if she showed a single ounce of weakness tonight, they would all be wearing orange prison jumpsuits by next week. The Black Excellence Gala began at 8 o'clock in the grand ballroom of the city's most expensive downtown hotel. It was a breathtaking display of opulent wealth and high society networking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 500 of Atlanta's most elite doctors, lawyers, judges, and entrepreneurs. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of expensive champagne and caviar. Terrence and Vivian worked the massive room with desperate, terrifying efficiency. They smiled, they hugged, they kissed cheeks, and they eagerly collected massive donation checks from their wealthy peers. The illusion of their absolute perfection was holding together by a microscopic thread. Jasmine stood rigidly next to Brad near the ice sculpture, both of them gripping their champagne flutes so tightly their knuckles turned white. They looked like terrified hostages forced to perform in a twisted stage play. But the wealthy guests were too busy networking to notice the sheer panic radiating from the newlyweds. At exactly 9 o'clock, the live jazz band slowly faded out. Terrence and Vivian confidently walked up the carpeted steps to the main stage, standing behind a crystal podium, bathed in bright white spotlights. Terrence tapped the microphone, producing a soft hum that brought the massive ballroom to a complete hush. He flashed his signature charismatic smile and began his grandstanding speech. He spoke passionately about the immense importance of generational wealth within the Black community. He preached about family loyalty, unwavering faith, and the absolute necessity of building up their local neighborhoods. Vivian stood right beside him, smiling beautifully, the ultimate picture of a devoted and successful matriarch. She looked out at the sea of wealthy donors, mentally calculating exactly how fast they could empty the charity escrow accounts. Terrence reached the emotional crescendo of his speech, raising his hands toward the ceiling as he declared that family values were the absolute bedrock of their entire financial empire. He opened his mouth to ask for the final round of massive donations. Right at that exact second, the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung violently open with a deafening crash. The sudden explosive noise echoed like a bomb going off in the cavernous room. The remaining ambient music abruptly stopped dead. Every single guest turned around in their seats, gasping in sheer shock. I stepped directly into the bright beam of the spotlight, wearing a razor-sharp, tailored white suit that cut through the darkness of the doorway like a blade. I did not come alone. I walked slowly and deliberately into the silent room, flanked perfectly by 4 massive muscular men wearing dark suits and communication earpieces. The ultimate reckoning had officially arrived, completely uninvited. The collective gasp of 500 affluent guests sucked the oxygen right out of the room. I did not sneak in through the kitchen like they forced me to do. At the wedding, I strode straight down the center aisle of the ballroom with the absolute authority of a woman who owned the ground they stood on. My 4 security escorts moved in perfect synchronization around me, creating an impenetrable physical barrier against anyone who might think about approaching. I kept my chin high and my gaze locked directly onto the main stage where my mother was standing, frozen in terror. Vivian had been in the middle of delivering a tearful monologue about family loyalty and community enrichment. Now her mouth hung open, and her hands gripped the sides of the crystal podium so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She stammered a few syllables into the microphone before the feedback whine forced her to step back. Terrence stood right beside her, his charismatic smile melting off his face, as if it had been burned away by acid. He stared at me with terrified eyes. I ignored their panic and took my seat at the front center table positioned below their feet. This was not just any table. It was the Platinum Sponsor Table, which required a minimum donation of $50,000 to secure. I had wired the funds from my account earlier that afternoon, ensuring I had the best view in the building to watch their empire collapse. My security team took the remaining seats at my table, folding their arms and staring blankly ahead. The whispering started immediately. The social circles of Atlanta are nothing if not predictable. Women in sequined gowns leaned across their floral centerpieces, murmuring behind manicured hands. Pastors from neighboring megachurches exchanged confused glances with local politicians, wondering why the disgraced dropout daughter had just commandeered the most expensive table in the venue. They all knew my parents' narrative that I was a failure struggling with mental instability. But sitting there in my bespoke white suit, radiating wealth and power, I contradicted every lie Vivian had ever told them over the past decade. I glanced toward the edge of the ballroom near the kitchen service exits. Brad was standing by a ice sculpture, sweating profusely through his rented tuxedo. He looked like a trapped animal scanning the perimeter for a clear path to run. He kept reaching his shaking hand into his front jacket pocket, likely feeling for his passport. He knew the amount of money he needed to escape the country was sitting in the charity escrow account, and he realized in that terrifying moment that I was standing directly between him and his only getaway ticket. The heavy silence in the grand room stretched on, becoming uncomfortable for the wealthy attendees. My parents remained frozen on the stage, paralyzed by their guilt and my unexpected presence. Terrence finally snapped out of his shock. He leaned over the podium and whispered something to the event coordinator standing near the stage stairs. He was signaling for the venue's private security to intervene and remove me from the premises before I could ruin his heist. I watched two hotel security guards begin to march down the aisle toward my table. Terrence smirked, believing his authority in this building would override my presence. But as the guards approached my table, my lead escort stood up and reached into his breast pocket. He produced a federal credential and flashed it to the guards. The venue security men stopped dead in their tracks, their faces draining of color. They backed away, raising their hands in a gesture of surrender, and retreated to the walls of the ballroom. Terrence watched his hired muscle abandon him, and a wave of panic washed over his sweating face. He grabbed the microphone, trying to wrap up the donation pitch, and hurried the guests toward the silent auction tables in the hall. He desperately wanted to scatter the audience before I could do any damage to his illusion. I decided the time for sitting in the background was officially over. I picked up my crystal champagne flute and a heavy silver dessert spoon. I tapped the cold metal against the fragile glass, sending a sharp, clear ringing sound cutting directly through the heavy tension of the room. I tapped it again, maintaining a slow, steady rhythm until every eye in the vast ballroom shifted away from the stage and focused entirely on me. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket with precision. I projected my voice across the silent room, demanding that the audiovisual technician hand me a microphone. Immediately, I announced loudly that as the $50,000 sponsor of the evening, I was entitled to address the donors before any funds were officially collected. Vivian shrieked into her microphone, demanding that the sound technicians cut my audio. She yelled that I was an unauthorized speaker attempting to ruin an event. But my private equity firm had already purchased the hotel venue's corporate debt 3 days ago. The event manager knew who signed his paychecks now. A technician scurried quickly over to my table and handed me a microphone before rushing away. I took a very deep breath, letting the incredible heavy weight of the moment settle fully over my shoulders. This was the ultimate culmination of 10 long years of isolation, hard work, and relentless dedication to my craft. I looked up at the raised stage where my parents were trapped under the bright stage lights, desperately clinging to a fake, fraudulent legacy that was about to be completely obliterated. I slowly raised the microphone to my mouth and offered a brilliant, chilling, predatory smile to the 500 wealthiest people gathered in Atlanta. My parents talk a whole lot about building generational wealth tonight. Let me show you exactly how they actually do it. Using the very money they intentionally stole from our own private family trust fund, I kept my eyes locked on my father as I pressed a button on my wireless presentation remote. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage instantly flickered. The elegant golden logo of the family charity vanished. In its place, a high-resolution display of raw, unedited financial bank statements illuminated the entire ballroom in a harsh blue light. I did not raise my voice or shout over the murmurs of the confused crowd. I spoke with the icy precision of a corporate auditor presenting a fatal quarterly review. I directed the attention of the 500 wealthy guests to the screen on the left. I told them to look closely at the routing numbers and the specific timestamps. I explained that the spreadsheet displayed every single charitable donation made to my parents' community outreach fund over the past 24 months. I then pointed to the screen on the right showing the exact corresponding outbound wire transfers. I broke down the undeniable math for the entire room. Every time a check was cleared for the supposed youth center or the neighborhood development initiative, the exact same dollar amount was immediately funneled into a private shell company controlled solely by Terrence. The room grew incredibly quiet. The only sound was the hum of the projectors and my steady voice echoing through the speakers. I highlighted a specific transaction from just 2 weeks ago. I read the donor name aloud, thanking the prominent local bishop sitting in the second row for his generous $200,000 contribution to the supposed scholarship fund. I then traced that exact $200,000 across the screen, showing how it bounced from the charity account to my father's private holding company, and finally landed squarely in an offshore Cayman Islands account registered to Bradford Miller. I turned my gaze to Brad, who was currently sweating heavily through his tuxedo near the ice sculpture. I formally introduced him to the Atlanta elite, not as the wealthy Boston Trust Fund heir my mother had relentlessly bragged about, but as a broke, desperate con artist, drowning in Massachusetts gambling debts. I laid bare the cold, hard truth that the generational wealth my parents worshipped was a complete fabrication. I told the room that Terrence and Vivian were so utterly blinded by their toxic obsession with securing a white son-in-law to parade around their country club that they happily financed his fraudulent lifestyle using stolen charity funds and embezzled money from my grandmother's trust. The reaction from the high society crowd was immediate and devastating. The polished facade of Southern etiquette shattered instantly. The bishop in the second row stood up, his face flushed with profound outrage, and signaled to his wife to grab her evening bag. A prominent city councilman, who had just publicly endorsed my father's charity initiative, pulled out his cell phone and frantically began dialing his legal team. Wealthy doctors and corporate executives murmured in sheer horror, realizing their generous tax-deductible donations had been used to pay off the bad debts of a white grifter. Chairs scraped loudly against the ballroom floor as people started standing up, actively distancing themselves from the main stage as if my parents had suddenly caught a highly contagious disease. Vivian stood at the crystal podium looking completely physically ill. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive designer gown could not hide the absolute terror radiating from her entire body. She tried to force a graceful smile, but her facial muscles simply refused to cooperate. She gripped the edges of the podium, swaying slightly on her expensive heels. The elite social circles she had spent decades ruthlessly climbing were crumbling to dust right before her eyes. The wealthy church ladies she desperately wanted to impress were currently staring at her with unfiltered, intense disgust. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of elegant Southern excuse, but no words came out. The illusion of her flawless black excellence was permanently dead. Near the back of the room, Jasmine watched the screens in total horror. She saw the undeniable proof that her fairy tale marriage was entirely funded by stolen money and charity fraud. She looked at Brad, begging him silently to deny it. But Brad was already slowly inching his way toward the kitchen service doors, trying to quietly escape the ballroom before the situation escalated any further. He knew the paper trail on those giant screens was absolutely bulletproof. Terrence, however, could not accept his public execution. His massive ego simply would not allow him to stand on that stage and be humiliated by the daughter he had thrown away. The shame of being exposed as a fraud in front of the wealthiest and most powerful black families in Atlanta pushed him completely over the edge into blinding primal rage. He dropped his microphone and it hit the stage floor with a loud, piercing feedback screech. Terrence let out a furious roar that tore through the chaotic chatter of the ballroom. He leaped down the steps of the main stage, his fists clenched and his eyes burning with violent intent. He completely abandoned his charismatic community leader persona, revealing the vicious, toxic bully he truly was. He lunged directly toward my platinum sponsor table, determined to physically rip the presentation remote from my hands and silence me by any means necessary. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply remained in my chair, watching him charge at me with a calm, unwavering stare. Before Terrence could even close the 10-foot gap between the stage and my table, the four massive men in dark suits who had escorted me into the building stepped swiftly forward. They moved in perfect unison, forming an impenetrable wall of solid muscle right in front of me. Terrence slammed into them, but they did not budge an inch. The lead man firmly grabbed my father's shoulder, stopping his violent momentum instantly. Terrence screamed at them to get out of his way, claiming he was the host of this exclusive event. The lead man did not argue or raise his voice. He simply reached inside his dark suit jacket, pulled out a heavy gold shield, and flashed it directly in my father's enraged face. He announced in a booming, commanding voice that they were special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and Terrence was officially under arrest. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute pandemonium the very second the federal agent flashed his gold badge. The polished elegance of the charity gala instantly evaporated into raw, visceral panic. Wealthy donors who had just been sipping imported champagne and adjusting their expensive diamond necklaces were now shoving each other out of the way, desperate to reach the main exits. The terrifying realization that they were sitting in the middle of an active federal crime scene sent the Atlanta elite scrambling for the doors. They cared about nothing but protecting their own reputations from the fallout of this massive financial scandal. Brad stood frozen near the massive swan ice sculpture. He watched the federal agents surround my father on the main stage, and the arrogant smirk completely melted off his face. The fake Boston Trust Fund heir suddenly realized that his entire elaborate con had just violently collapsed. Brad did not try to defend his father-in-law, and he certainly did not run to protect his sobbing wife Jasmine. He did exactly what cowards always do when they are finally cornered. He bolted. Brad turned on his heels and broke into a frantic, desperate sprint. He shoved roughly past a terrified elderly churchwoman, sending her crashing into a floral centerpiece. He kicked over a row of gold-painted Chiavari chairs, creating a chaotic obstacle course for anyone trying to pursue him. His panicked eyes were locked onto the heavy wooden swinging doors that led into the catering kitchen. It was the exact same kitchen entrance where my mother had cruelly banished me to sit next to the trash cans just days ago at his wedding. Brad hit the carpeted floor, running at full speed, fully intending to vanish through the service elevator and disappear into the humid Atlanta night. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy wooden doors, but the doors did not swing open. Instead, they were kicked violently outward from the other side. 3 more federal agents in tactical gear burst out of the kitchen, moving with terrifying, lethal speed. Brad tried to break his momentum, but the smooth leather soles of his expensive tuxedo shoes slipped on the polished ballroom floor. A massive federal agent lunged forward and brutally tackled Brad right around his waist. The impact lifted the con artist entirely off his feet. They flew through the air and crashed directly into a towering 10-tier pyramid of crystal champagne glasses. The deafening sound of shattering crystal and snapping wood echoed over the screaming crowd. Hundreds of expensive glass shards rained down on the carpet. Brad was pinned brutally against the floor, his custom tuxedo completely soaked in spilled champagne and his face pressed into the sticky carpet. He began sobbing hysterically, crying out that he demanded to call his father, claiming he had diplomatic immunity, and shouting a string of pathetic lies. The federal agent simply jammed a knee into Brad's spine and sharply clicked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Back on the main stage, the situation was equally devastating. Terrence was violently spun around by the lead agent. My father, the proud, untouchable patriarch of our family, was shoved face first against the clear acrylic podium he had just used to preach about black excellence and generational wealth. The agents pulled his arms forcefully behind his back, the harsh metallic snap of the handcuffs locking over the cuffs of his custom-tailored velvet tuxedo sounded like a death knell. Terrence tried desperately to leverage his fake social status. He yelled at the top of his lungs, demanding that the agents release him immediately. He screamed that he personally played golf with the chief of police and regularly hosted private dinners for the mayor of Atlanta. He angrily accused the agents of orchestrating a racially motivated setup to tear down a successful black businessman. The lead agent did not even blink. He leaned in close to my father's ear and coldly informed him that the mayor and the police chief were the exact individuals who had enthusiastically signed off on the federal arrest warrant after reviewing the massive financial audit provided by Obsidian Capital. The cruelty of the high society crowd was absolute. The very pastors, politicians, and country club friends who had just been applauding my father were now standing in a wide circle holding up their glowing cell phones. Camera flashes went off relentlessly. They were actively recording the spectacular, devastating downfall of Terrence and Vivian, eagerly capturing every humiliating second of the raid to share on social media. Vivian completely lost her mind. The perfectly manicured, composed matriarch unraveled right in front of the flashing cameras. She dropped heavily to her knees on the stage, abandoning every single ounce of her Southern dignity. She reached out and desperately grabbed the legs of the federal agents, shrieking at the top of her lungs that there had been a terrible, catastrophic mistake. She wailed that they were prominent pillars of the community, heavily respected members of the most exclusive golf clubs in Georgia. As she thrashed wildly on the stage floor, her expensive designer lace gown snagged on a microphone stand and tore loudly. The violent, erratic movement caused her perfectly pinned lace front wig to shift dramatically to the side, exposing her natural braided hair underneath. Vivian did not even care about her ruined aesthetic. She was completely consumed by the terrifying reality of impending federal prison time. In the corner of the ballroom, Jasmine stood completely paralyzed. She watched her fraudulent white prince bleeding and crying in a puddle of shattered glass, while her untouchable parents were being read their Miranda rights on a brightly lit stage. The fairy tale she had sacrificed her own sister to protect was burning to ash right before her very eyes. Vivian suddenly stopped screaming at the arresting agents. Her wild, panicked eyes scanned the chaotic ballroom until they locked onto me. I was still sitting calmly at the platinum sponsor table, entirely untouched by the destruction unfolding around me. Vivian realized the federal agents did not care about her country club status, but she knew I had the power and the capital to make this all go away. My mother scrambled off the stage, tearing the hem of her gown even further. She ran frantically across the ballroom floor, pushing past the recording guests. She lunged straight past my security guards and grabbed my arm with her manicured nails, digging deeply into my skin. Vivian looked at me with a face completely twisted by sheer terror and desperation. "Nadia, stop them," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. "Tell them it is a mistake. We are your blood. We are your family." Vivian's frantic grip on my arm felt like the desperate clawing of a drowning woman. Her manicured nails, the ones she proudly flashed at the exclusive country club every single weekend, were now digging sharply into the pristine white fabric of my custom suit jacket. She looked up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. Her expensive mascara was running in thick black rivers down her perfectly contoured cheeks. Her heavy lace front wig had shifted entirely off-center during her theatrical struggle on the stage, exposing the tightly braided hair underneath. She was an absolute wreck, completely stripped of her fake Southern charm and her manufactured black excellence. She repeated her frantic plea, sobbing uncontrollably and demanding I use my corporate power to call off the federal agents. She shrieked that we were blood and that a loyal daughter must always protect her family from public ruin. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of empathy for her pathetic display. I slowly looked down at her trembling hands. With slow, deliberate precision, I reached over and peeled her fingers off my jacket one by one. The physical rejection hit her harder than a physical blow. Stumbled backward, gasping for air, as if I had just knocked the wind right out of her lungs. I looked my mother dead in the eye and let the absolute silence of the ballroom amplify my words. I told her that she lost the right to invoke the sacred word family the very day she chose a fraudulent white con artist over her own flesh and blood. I reminded her of every single time she looked down her nose at me and called me a worthless college dropout simply because I chose to build an empire instead of attending the law school she picked out for me. I reminded her of the brutal slap she delivered across my face at Sunday dinner, simply because I tried to warn her that Brad was bleeding our generational wealth entirely dry. Vivian shook her head violently, trying to deny her own toxic actions. She cried out that she was only doing what she thought was best for our social standing in Atlanta. She begged me to understand the intense pressure she faced to keep up appearances among the wealthy megachurch pastors and the political elite. She claimed her intentions were always rooted in deep maternal love and protecting our prestigious family legacy from any scandalous gossip. I stepped closer to her, forcing her to look at the absolute ruin she had caused. I swept my hand toward the grand stage where Terrence was currently being read his Miranda rights by armed federal agents. I pointed toward the swinging kitchen doors where Brad was bleeding on the carpet in heavy steel handcuffs. I asked her if this humiliating public spectacle was the grand legacy she sacrificed my mental health to protect. I watched the horrible realization finally sink into her tear-stained face. She had traded her actual billionaire daughter for a cheap, racist illusion that landed her husband in a federal penitentiary. Vivian fell to her knees, clutching her torn designer gown. She sobbed that she was so incredibly sorry and promised she would make it up to me if I just paid the massive restitution and made the FBI go away. She was still trying to negotiate a desperate business deal, masquerading as a genuine maternal apology. I stared down at the pathetic woman groveling on the expensive hotel carpet. I delivered the final killing blow with absolute chilling calmness, making sure my voice carried clearly across the silent room. I told her that blood does not seat you by the trash cans, Vivian. I reminded her of the humiliating folding chair she forced me into at Jasmine's extravagant wedding just days ago. I laid out the brutal, undeniable truth that she wanted to protect her flawless elite image so badly that she sold her soul to a white con artist and threw her own daughter away like absolute garbage. I leaned down slightly so my gaze locked directly with hers. I told her to have fun explaining this spectacular federal indictment to her snobby friends at the bridge club. Vivian let out a haunting, agonizing wail. It was the horrific sound of a woman who had just watched her entire universe burn to ashes. The wealthy Atlanta socialites surrounding us did not rush forward to comfort her. Instead, they backed further away, holding their glowing cell phones high in the air. The blinding flashes of smartphone cameras lit up the grand ballroom like a terrifying strobe light. The very people Vivian had spent 3 decades trying to impress were now eagerly documenting her catastrophic downfall for local gossip blogs and social media feeds. They were completely merciless. I turned my back on my mother without a single second of hesitation. I buttoned my white suit jacket and signaled my security team. They instantly formed a tight protective wedge around me, carving a clear path through the sea of stunned billionaires and terrified politicians. Nobody dared to speak to me or step in my way. The power dynamic in the room was absolute and undeniable. As I walked down the center aisle, I passed Jasmine. My golden child sister was slumped against a cocktail table, completely paralyzed by shock. Her fairy tale life was officially over. She was facing millions in debt and severe federal scrutiny, all because she blindly followed our mother's toxic playbook. She looked at me with pleading eyes, but I did not even break my stride. I owed her absolutely nothing. I pushed through the heavy gold-plated doors of the grand ballroom and stepped out into the quiet luxury of the hotel lobby. The chaotic screaming of my parents and the harsh barking of federal agents faded behind the thick mahogany doors. I walked confidently out the front entrance of the building into the dark night. Exactly 2 weeks after I walked out of that hotel lobby into the dark night, the absolute reality of federal justice descended upon my parents' sprawling Buckhead estate. The heavy Georgia morning air was thick and oppressive, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating tension radiating from the manicured front lawn. A county sheriff deputy stood near the pristine rose bushes holding a heavy steel mallet. I leaned against the polished hood of my Maybach and watched with total clinical detachment as he aggressively hammered a large, bright red and white foreclosure sign directly into the perfectly green grass. The sharp metallic thuds echoed across the wealthy neighborhood, shattering the quiet peace of the exclusive cul-de-sac. Several affluent neighbors, the very same people who had eagerly recorded my mother's meltdown at the charity gala, were now standing on their expansive front porches in their silk robes, openly sipping their morning coffee and watching the final destruction of Terrence's fraudulent empire. I walked up the sweeping brick driveway and stepped through the massive wrought iron double doors. The interior of the mansion was completely unrecognizable from the pristine museum of black excellence I had grown up in. A team of federal asset forfeiture agents and local law enforcement officers were systematically moving through the massive house. They were slapping neon green evidence tags on everything that held significant value. The grand piano, the imported Italian leather sofas, the massive crystal chandeliers, and every single piece of expensive artwork were officially marked for government seizure. Because Terrence had recklessly commingled his dirty Boston money with the embezzled funds from my grandmother's trust, nearly every single physical asset inside this house was now legally classified as the direct proceeds of federal wire fraud. Terrence was nowhere to be seen because a federal judge had flatly denied his bail, viewing him as a severe flight risk after discovering his offshore Cayman Islands accounts. My father was currently sitting in a cold concrete cell wearing a standard issue orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of his tailored suits and his booming, arrogant authority. That left Vivian entirely alone to face the devastating consequences of her blinding vanity. I found my mother standing in the center of the grand master bedroom. She was an absolute hollow shell of the terrifying matriarch who had banished me to the kitchen hallway. Her expensive lace front wigs had been seized along with her custom jewelry collection, leaving her wearing a plain gray head wrap. She was desperately trying to shove her expensive silk blouses and cashmere sweaters into her matching set of vintage Louis Vuitton luggage. A female federal agent stepped forward and firmly placed her hand on top of the designer suitcase. The agent coldly informed Vivian that the luxury luggage set was purchased using an account linked directly to the fraudulent charity fund. Therefore, the suitcases were officially government property and could not leave the premises. The agent reached into her supply kit and tossed a tight roll of heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags directly onto the hardwood floor. She instructed my mother that she was only legally allowed to take essential non-designer clothing, and she had exactly 15 minutes to pack it all into the trash bags before she was physically escorted off the property. Vivian stared at the black plastic garbage bags with a look of profound, absolute horror. The sheer indignity of packing her life into trash bags completely broke whatever tiny fraction of sanity she had left. She spun around and locked her bloodshot, furious eyes on me. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking manicured finger at my face. She unleashed a torrential flood of venomous curses, screaming that I was an unnatural demonic daughter who was going to burn in hell for destroying my own flesh and blood. She shrieked that she was a highly respected woman of faith and that I would never ever find peace after bringing such a massive catastrophic disgrace upon our sacred family name. I did not flinch, I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not offer her a single ounce of pity. I simply reached into the pocket of my custom-tailored blazer and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. I walked slowly across the bedroom and held the money out, holding it suspended in the empty air between us. I looked my mother directly in the eyes and delivered my words with a quiet, terrifying, lethal precision. I reminded her of a rainy Tuesday night 10 years ago when I was a struggling college student. I reminded her how I had called her begging for a ride home because my car had broken down in a dangerous neighborhood and I had absolutely no money left. I reminded her that she had laughed into the phone, told me that my struggles were the price of disappointing her, and coldly ordered me to figure it out myself. I pushed the $50 bill directly into her shaking, sweaty palm. I told her to take an Uber. I told her to call a cheap rideshare and drag her black garbage bags out to the curb exactly like she told me to do when I was desperate and alone. Vivian looked down at the money in her hand and let out a broken, agonizing sob. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the floor weeping uncontrollably as the federal agents moved in to physically remove her from the mansion. I turned my back on my weeping mother and confidently walked down the sweeping grand staircase. I stepped out of the front doors, breathing in the thick, warm Georgia air. I walked down the long driveway, ignoring the whispering neighbors, and slid comfortably into the plush leather back seat of my waiting vehicle. I instructed my driver to take me back to my corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. As the luxury car quietly rolled out of the affluent neighborhood, my secure business phone began to vibrate aggressively in my pocket. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number, but I immediately answered the call anyway. A shaky, terrified voice echoed through the speaker. It was my sister Jasmine calling. My golden child sister was crying hysterically from a cheap roach-infested motel off Interstate 20. She had been frantically digging through the single canvas duffel bag of personal belongings the feds had allowed Brad to keep before they hauled him away in handcuffs. She told me that she had found a hidden compartment ripped into the inner lining of the bag. Jasmine gasped for air, sobbing that she had just discovered something incredibly dangerous that the federal authorities completely missed during their raid. She told me she had found a heavy antique brass safety deposit box key. The sleek black Maybach idled smoothly in the reserved parking spot outside the imposing granite facade of the First National Bank of Atlanta. I sat in the plush leather passenger seat, watching the heavy rain slide down the tinted windows. Next to me, Jasmine was curled into a tight, trembling ball of anxiety. Her designer clothes looked entirely out of place, hanging loosely on her suddenly fragile frame. Her manicured hands tightly clutched the heavy antique brass safety deposit box key she had discovered hidden in the lining of Brad's confiscated duffel bag. We were about to uncover exactly what kind of monster my parents had welcomed into our family. I instructed my security team to remain by the vehicle and walked with my sister through the revolving glass doors of the bank. The branch manager immediately recognized me and ushered us past the long lines of waiting customers directly into the highly secure subterranean vault. Jasmine handed the brass key to the vault attendant with shaking fingers. The attendant used the bank's master key in tandem with Brad's key to unlock a long, heavy steel drawer. He slid the metal box out, placed it on a polished wooden table in a private viewing room, and quietly closed the door, leaving us completely alone. Jasmine stared at the closed metal box as if it were a live explosive. I did not wait for her to gather her courage. I stepped forward, flipped the metal latch, and pushed the heavy lid open. I fully expected to find offshore bank account tokens, forged property deeds, or perhaps fake passports under various aliases. What I actually found was infinitely more terrifying. The metal box was packed entirely with thick, bound legal documents. I pulled out the top folder and flipped it open. It was a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy. I scanned the beneficiary line and felt a cold, sharp chill run straight down my spine. The policy was taken out exactly 6 months ago. It was a $10 million term life policy. The insured individual was my father, Terrence. The sole primary beneficiary was Bradford Miller. I quickly grabbed this next folder, and then the next. The reality of Brad's horrifying endgame became absolutely undeniable. There was a separate $8 million policy taken out on Vivian, and beneath that a staggering $15 million policy taken out on my sister Jasmine. All of them listed Brad as the absolute sole beneficiary. Every single policy had an accelerated payout clause, specifically covering accidental death or sudden fatal illness. I dropped the heavy folders onto the wooden table. The loud smack echoed in the small, quiet viewing room. I looked at Jasmine, who was staring at the documents with wide, unblinking eyes. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll about to shatter into a million pieces. I did not sugarcoat the terrifying truth. I looked my sister dead in the eye and laid out the brutal, undeniable facts. I told her that Brad was not simply a slick con artist trying to drain our parents' retirement accounts. I explained that Brad's financial debts in Boston were so massive, so completely insurmountable, that stealing Terrence's church charity funds was never going to be enough to save him. I pointed directly at the $15 million policy bearing her name. I told Jasmine that once the bank started calling in Brad's fraudulent loans, he had a very specific, very permanent backup plan. Brad was planning to kill her. Jasmine let out a choked, agonizing sound. She stumbled backward, hitting the wall of the secure viewing room, and slowly slid down until she was sitting on the cold marble floor. The flawless illusion she had sacrificed everything to protect had just morphed into a horrific nightmare. She realized with absolute crushing clarity that the charming, wealthy white husband my parents had practically worshipped was actually actively planning to murder their entire family for a massive insurance payout. She wept openly, clutching her knees to her chest. Jasmine cried out that she was so incredibly stupid. She admitted that she ignored every single red flag because Vivian constantly pressured her to maintain the perfect image of a high society Atlanta marriage. She sobbed that she almost lost her actual life simply because she wanted to prove she was better than the sister our parents had discarded. I stood over her, feeling a strange, complex mixture of profound disgust and sudden, overwhelming responsibility. This was the exact toxic rot I had spent 10 years trying to escape. My parents' deep obsession with white validation and country club status had literally invited a murderous predator right through their front door. They were so desperate to be adjacent to perceived white generational wealth that they completely ignored the fact that their golden child was sleeping next to a man plotting her assassination. I did not offer Jasmine a hug. The time for soft sisterly comfort had passed long ago. I knelt down, retrieved the thick insurance policies from the table, and secured them safely inside my leather briefcase. I looked at the weeping woman on the floor and told her that her tears were completely useless right now. I explained that we had just escalated the situation from a simple federal financial crime into a massive multi-agency criminal investigation. I informed Jasmine that with these specific documents in my possession, I now held the absolute power to legally upgrade Brad's federal wire fraud charges into attempted murder and severe insurance fraud. I told her that her fake husband was never going to see the outside of a federal penitentiary ever again. I closed my briefcase with a sharp, definitive click, signaling the end of her fairy tale and the beginning of my absolute reign. I ordered her to stand up, wipe her face, and walk out of this bank with her head held high because we had a very important meeting with the federal prosecutor waiting for us. The federal prosecutor's office in downtown Atlanta was a sterile, imposing fortress of frosted glass and brushed steel. I walked into the expansive conference room, flanked by two of my senior litigation attorneys. Jasmine trailed closely behind me, her head bowed and her hands trembling as she clutched the strap of her designer handbag. Across the wide, polished oak table sat the lead federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Special Agent Reynolds. She had spent the last 72 hours methodically dismantling my parents' fraudulent charity empire, and she looked incredibly pleased with her swift progress. Reynolds confidently slid a blue legal folder across the table toward me. She announced that Bradford Miller had officially caved during his initial interrogation. He had desperately offered up Terrence as the primary mastermind of the money laundering operation in exchange for a highly favorable plea deal. The prosecutor explained that because Brad was a first-time offender and had provided crucial bank routing numbers, he was looking at a very comfortable 5-year sentence in a minimum security white-collar facility. He would likely be out in 3 years with good behavior. I did not touch the blue folder. I sat back in my plush leather chair, maintaining absolute perfect stillness. I looked at the prosecutor and told her that a 5-year sentence in a country club prison for stealing millions of dollars from an inner-city charity was completely unacceptable. I stated clearly that Brad was a predator who specifically targeted and manipulated an insecure black family to fund his Massachusetts debts. Reynolds sighed, leaning forward with a patronizing bureaucratic smile. She tried to explain the complex realities of federal plea bargains, insisting that securing a conviction against my father, Terrence, was her absolute top priority. She claimed that letting Brad off with a lighter sentence was simply the necessary cost of doing federal business. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of frustration. I slowly reached into my bespoke leather briefcase. I pulled out the heavy manila folder containing the 3 massive life insurance policies I had just retrieved from Brad's hidden safety deposit box. I slid the thick stack of documents across the polished oak table. It stopped precisely in front of Special Agent Reynolds. I watched the prosecutor's patronizing smile instantly vanish as she opened the folder. I calmly narrated exactly what she was reading. I detailed the $10 million policy on my father, the $8 million policy on my mother, and the staggering $15 million policy taken out on my sister Jasmine. I pointed out the specific accelerated payout clauses for accidental death. I then slid a secondary document across the table. It was a digital forensic report my team had compiled overnight. The report showed Brad's recent internet search history retrieved from his confiscated laptop. He had been extensively researching untraceable poisons, lethal dosages of common prescription medications, and the specific response times of emergency services in my parents' wealthy suburban zip code. I told the federal prosecutor that she was no longer negotiating a simple financial plea deal for a white-collar con artist. I informed her that she was currently holding absolute, irrefutable proof of massive insurance fraud and a highly premeditated triple homicide plot. I demanded she tear up the 5-year plea agreement immediately. I insisted she upgrade Brad's charges to attempted murder and ensure he never saw the outside of a maximum security federal penitentiary ever again. Reynolds stared at the horrifying documents, her face completely pale. The sheer magnitude of Brad's monstrous endgame was undeniable. She slowly closed the folder, her hands shaking slightly. She looked at me with profound, newfound respect. She picked up the blue folder containing the original 5-year plea deal and tore it straight down the middle, throwing the pieces into the trash can beside her desk. She promised me that Bradford Miller would be facing a mandatory minimum of 25 years without any possibility of early parole. As we walked out of the federal building and stepped into the blistering afternoon heat, Jasmine finally broke her silence. She had watched the entire brutal negotiation without saying a single word. Now she stopped on the concrete steps, completely ignoring the busy crowds of lawyers and government employees rushing past us. She looked at me with red-rimmed, exhausted eyes. The heavy layers of her fake high society persona had been completely burned away, leaving only a deeply broken, terrified woman behind. Jasmine admitted that she had always hated me. She confessed that her vicious cruelty at the wedding and her relentless bullying throughout our entire childhood was never actually about my physical appearance or my decision to drop out of Spelman. She choked back a sob and revealed the ugly, honest truth. She hated me because I was smart enough and brave enough to see straight through our parents' toxic, fraudulent facade. I had the profound courage to walk away from their suffocating expectations and build something incredibly real while she was completely trapped by her desperate need for their conditional approval. She cried, admitting that she sacrificed her own identity and almost lost her actual life, simply because she wanted to be the perfect golden child, standing next to the perfect wealthy white husband. She told me she was deeply, intensely envious of my absolute freedom. I looked at my younger sister standing broken on the courthouse steps. I did not offer her a comforting hug or a sympathetic smile. I simply told her that freedom is never given freely. It must be violently seized from the people who desperately want to keep you chained to their own failures. I told her the first step toward actual freedom was facing the massive mountain of debt she had foolishly signed her name to. Before Jasmine could respond, my secure business phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out, checking the caller identification. It was an automated message from the Federal Detention Center located on the outskirts of Atlanta. My father, Terrence, was calling from lockup. He had officially used his one allowed phone call for the day. He did not call his expensive defense attorney. He did not call Vivian, who was currently packing her life into garbage bags at the foreclosed mansion. Terrence requested a visitor. He only wanted to see me. The Federal Detention Center in downtown Atlanta was a massive concrete fortress, devoid of any natural light or southern charm. I walked through the heavy security doors, wearing a pristine black tailored suit, and carried a single leather portfolio. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the sterile white walls. A female guard escorted me into the private visitation room. The room smelled strongly of bleach and old coffee. I sat down at the cold steel table and folded my hands, waiting patiently for the man who used to dictate my entire existence. A heavy metal door on the opposite side of the room buzzed loudly and slid open. Terrence shuffled into the visitation room, wearing a shapeless orange jumpsuit and cheap canvas slip-on shoes. The transformation was absolutely staggering. My father had spent his entire adult life meticulously curating his image as a wealthy, untouchable pillar of the Atlanta elite community. Now the expensive haircuts and luxury colognes were gone. He looked incredibly old and deeply exhausted. His posture was slumped, and his shoulders sagged under the heavy weight of his impending federal prison sentence. He sat down heavily in the metal chair across from me. He looked at my designer suit and my perfectly styled hair. I fully expected him to drop his head and finally offer a genuine apology for stealing my inheritance and sacrificing my mental health to protect a white con artist. I thought the stark, terrifying reality of federal lockup might have finally broken his massive ego. But I was completely wrong. Toxic narcissism does not simply evaporate behind steel bars. Terrence leaned forward and placed his chained hands on the metal table. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not express any remorse for funding a man who took out a massive life insurance policy on his own daughter. Instead, his face twisted into a familiar mask of arrogant condescension. He looked me directly in the eye and aggressively demanded to know why my corporate lawyers had not yet arranged for his bail. He lowered his voice to a harsh whisper and scolded me as if I were a disobedient child interrupting a church service. Terrence angrily declared that I had completely humiliated him in front of his entire country club. He insisted that a loyal daughter would have used her private equity firm to save the family quietly. He firmly believed that preserving our fake image of flawless black excellence was far more important than stopping a violent criminal from murdering his youngest child. I sat perfectly still, listening to his delusional rant. I did not raise my voice, and I did not shed a single tear. Any anger or childhood resentment I held toward this man vanished in that exact moment. It was entirely replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. I looked at the man who gave me life and realized he was completely hollow inside. He was so intensely obsessed with how wealthy people perceived him that he had entirely lost his own humanity. I did not argue with him or attempt to defend my actions. There was no point in trying to reason with a man who prioritized a country club membership over the actual lives of his own children. I slowly unzipped my leather portfolio. I pulled out a single legal document printed on thick, heavy paper. I slid it across the cold steel table. It stopped precisely in front of his chained hands. Terrence stopped his angry rambling and looked down at the document. He frowned and asked if it was a legal strategy from my corporate team to transfer his frozen assets into a hidden offshore account. I looked him dead in the eye and shattered his final delusion. I told him that my legal team was not representing him, and I would never spend a single penny of my wealth to save a man who gladly threw me away. I explained that the paper in front of him was a total severance of our familial relationship. I had my attorneys draft a formal cessation of all parental rights and obligations. I was legally ensuring that he could never claim me as his kin ever again. Terrence stared at the document, his mouth opening and closing in sheer disbelief. He looked up at me with panicked eyes, finally realizing that I was not there to rescue him from the catastrophic mess he created. I was simply there to permanently close the door on our relationship. He began to stammer out a desperate plea, claiming that we shared the same blood and I owed him my respect. I stood up from the metal chair and looked down at him with absolute chilling calmness. I told him that respect is earned through honesty and love, not through manipulation and theft. I told him he chose his legacy the night he drained my grandmother's trust fund to impress a racist fraud. I advised him to sign the severance document and give it to the prison guard because it was the very last piece of paperwork I would ever share with him. I turned my back on my father and walked out of the sterile visitation room without a second of hesitation. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind me, sealing Terrence inside his new permanent reality. I stepped out of the federal detention center and walked into the bright, warm Atlanta sunshine. The chain that had dragged me down for my entire life was finally broken. I walked toward my waiting vehicle. Just as my driver opened the car door, my phone buzzed aggressively in my pocket. The screen showed an urgent security alert. The message stated that my mother Vivian had just shown up completely unannounced at the massive corporate headquarters of Obsidian Capital. The notification warned that she was causing a massive scene in the main glass lobby, aggressively demanding to see the chief executive officer immediately. I walked through the revolving glass doors of my corporate headquarters with my security team close behind me. The polished marble lobby of Obsidian Capital was usually a sanctuary of quiet professional efficiency, but today the serene atmosphere was completely shattered. My mother Vivian was standing aggressively over the curved reception desk. She looked absolutely haggard and entirely unrecognizable from the pristine high society matriarch she pretended to be just a few short weeks ago. Her expensive designer clothes were permanently replaced by a wrinkled linen blouse and cheap slacks. She was not wearing her custom lace front wig. Instead, her natural hair was tied back in a messy, uneven bun. Vivian slammed her bare hands flat against the pristine glass desk. She shouted at my terrified receptionist demanding immediate access to the top floor. She yelled that she was the mother of the chief executive officer and she did not need an appointment to see the daughter she carried in her own womb. The receptionist nervously picked up the phone to call building security, but I signaled for her to put it down. I stepped out of the shadow of the entryway and walked slowly forward. I walked across the vast lobby floor. The sharp click of my designer heels echoed loudly against the marble, instantly drawing my mother's frantic attention. Vivian spun around and locked her desperate bloodshot eyes on me. For a fraction of a second, she tried to stand up straight and project her old, familiar dominance. She tried to summon the haughty, arrogant glare she had used to terrorize me throughout my entire childhood, but she simply did not have the power anymore. She was a broken, destitute woman standing in the middle of an empire she had never built. She rushed toward me, but my security guards immediately stepped forward, blocking her path. Vivian stopped short, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. She demanded that I instruct my guards to step aside. She yelled that she was my mother and commanded absolute respect. I looked at her with total clinical indifference. I told her that respect is a currency she officially ran out of the night she tried to sacrifice my sister to a federal prosecutor just to save her country club membership. Vivian ignored my brutal honesty and immediately launched into a hysterical rant. She completely bypassed any sort of maternal apology and went straight to demanding financial compensation. She shrieked that she was currently living in a cheap, filthy apartment complex on the wrong side of Atlanta. She yelled that she had to sell her wedding ring just to afford basic groceries because the government had seized every single bank account associated with my father's fraudulent church charity. Then she delivered the most insanely delusional demand I had ever heard. Vivian looked around my massive corporate lobby and loudly declared that she was owed a significant percentage of my firm. She aggressively claimed that she gave birth to me, clothed me, and fed me. She yelled that my entire existence was solely thanks to her maternal sacrifice, and therefore she was legally and morally entitled to a massive cut of my corporate profits to fund her retirement. She demanded a check for $5 million and a luxury condominium in Buckhead, insisting it was the absolute least I could do to repay her for raising me. I stood perfectly still, letting her pathetic, greedy demands hang heavily in the chilled air of the expansive lobby right now. Several of my corporate employees had stopped walking and were openly staring at the psychotic woman screaming at their boss. I did not feel a single ounce of embarrassment. I wanted them to see exactly what kind of monster I had successfully defeated. I looked my mother dead in the eye and completely dismantled her delusional maternal entitlement. I kept my voice incredibly calm, delivering each word with lethal precision. I told Vivian that giving birth is a biological function, not a blank check for lifelong financial extortion. I reminded her of the endless times she mocked me. I reminded her how she looked me directly in the face and called me an ugly, embarrassing failure, simply because I refused to conform to her toxic, shallow obsession with wealthy, white validation. I reminded her of my 19th birthday. I reminded her how she refused to attend my small celebration because she was too busy hosting a lavish welcome dinner for Brad's racist parents. I reminded her how she forced me to sit next to the foul-smelling kitchen trash cans at Jasmine's wedding because my very presence threatened her fragile, desperate illusion of Black excellence today. I told her she never prioritized love or family. She only prioritized status designer handbags and the fleeting approval of wealthy church gossips who secretly laughed behind her back. Vivian began to weep, loud gasping sobs that echoed through the lobby. She tried to play the victim, crying out that she did the best she could with a difficult, rebellious daughter. She begged me to show her mercy, claiming she was an old woman who had lost absolutely everything. I looked at her tears and felt absolutely nothing. The emotional well had completely dried up for her. I told her she did not lose everything. I told her she actively destroyed everything with her own two hands. I turned my gaze away from her and looked directly at the head of my security team. I gave a single subtle nod. Two massive security guards immediately stepped forward and grabbed Vivian firmly by both arms. My mother shrieked in absolute terror. She thrashed wildly, kicking her feet and screaming my name. I watched them drag her across the polished marble floor. I told her that the toxic umbilical cord connecting us was officially and permanently severed. I instructed the guards to throw her out onto the hot Atlanta sidewalk and permanently ban her from the corporate premises forever. Exactly 1 month passed since the federal authorities dismantled the grand illusion my parents had spent their entire lives building. I drove into the sun-baked parking lot of a discount grocery store on the outer edges of the city. It was a stark contrast to the luxury boutiques and marble-lined country clubs our family used to frequent. I stepped out of my air-conditioned car and walked through the sliding automatic doors. Harsh fluorescent lighting buzzed aggressively overhead, illuminating rows of cheap linoleum aisles and towering stacks of bulk merchandise. I did not come here to gloat or to witness a spectacle. I just needed cold water after a long morning of corporate meetings. I grabbed a plastic water bottle from the refrigerated section and walked toward the checkout lanes. There was no red carpet and no flashing cameras waiting for me. There was only a tired line of people trying to buy their groceries. I stepped into lane 4 and looked at the cashier ringing up customers. It was my younger sister, Jasmine. The former golden child of Atlanta high society stood behind a battered scanning belt. She wore an unflattering, stiff polyester uniform polo shirt in a highly visible shade of bright neon green. Her pristine manicures were completely gone, replaced by short, unpolished fingernails. The expensive custom lace wedding gown and the millions of dollars in fraudulent loans felt like an entire lifetime ago. She looked physically exhausted, but for the very first time in 28 years, she actually looked like a real human being. I stepped up to the counter and placed my plastic water bottle onto the moving black rubber belt. Jasmine did not immediately look up. She mechanically grabbed the bottle, scanned the barcode, and recited the total price in a monotone voice. Then she raised her eyes and completely froze. She recognized my tailored designer suit before she even processed my face. We stood there separated by a cheap plastic grocery divider and a lifetime of profound toxic resentment. I waited for the inevitable reaction. I expected her to hide in shame or start screaming at me for destroying her fairy tale life. I braced myself for the bitter accusations and the desperate demands for financial rescue that our mother Vivian had aggressively tried to extort from me. Jasmine did not do any of those things. She did not beg me to pay off her mounting legal debts. She did not ask me to wire her $1 million to rescue her from this minimum wage reality. She simply looked down at the cash register, took a slow, deep breath, and met my gaze with a level of profound, raw honesty I had never seen from her before. She processed my payment, handed me my receipt, and then she offered something entirely unexpected. Jasmine sincerely apologized to me. She kept her voice incredibly quiet, ensuring the customers in the next lane could not hear our private conversation. She told me that I was absolutely right about everything I had said in that corporate boardroom. She admitted with a breaking voice that she was nothing but an empty, shallow shell of a person for her entire adult life. She confessed that she had spent decades blindly following our mother's twisted playbook, desperately chasing the validation of a racist high society that never actually cared about her. She acknowledged how viciously cruel she had been to me when I was struggling to build my private equity firm. She told me she was deeply ashamed of the woman she became just to keep up a fake, flawless image. I stood quietly holding my receipt and listening to my sister finally take absolute accountability for her own toxic actions. She told me that the federal authorities had stripped her of every single fraudulent asset Brad had illegally purchased. She was living in a tiny studio apartment and taking the public bus to work every single morning at 5. But then Jasmine stood up a little straighter behind the register. She looked at her ugly neon green uniform and told me that despite the physical exhaustion, she was finally learning how to actually work. She was learning the true value of a single dollar earned through honest manual labor instead of theft and manipulation. She said she was finally building a life that actually belonged to her. I looked at Jasmine and realized the federal collapse of our family was the greatest gift she could have ever received. The massive, devastating fire had burned away all the fake societal rot and left behind a clean foundation. I did not offer her a warm, comforting hug. I certainly did not offer to hand her $1 million check to magically fix her temporary discomfort. Buying her way out of the struggle would only reinforce the exact same toxic dependency our parents had weaponized against her. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a simple manila folder. I slid the folder slowly across the scratched laminate counter, stopping it right next to the cash register scanner. I told her to open it when her shift ended. Inside that folder was an official admissions application for a rigorous finance and accounting program at the local community college. Tucked neatly behind the application was a certified cashier's check cut for the exact precise amount of a single semester's tuition and absolutely nothing more. I looked my sister dead in the eye and delivered my final mandate. I told her to take the classes, learn how real wealth is actually structured, and earn her success this time. Jasmine stared down at the manila folder. She did not complain about starting at a community college. She did not ask for a larger check. Genuine hot tears spilled over her eyelashes and rolled down her cheeks. She wiped them away and gave me a firm, determined nod. She was finally taking the first real step toward true independence. 6 months passed since the devastating collapse of my parents' manufactured dynasty. The sweltering Atlanta summer gave way to a crisp, biting winter, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the cold reality facing the men who tried to destroy me. Bradford Miller was currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary in Florence, Colorado. His carefully crafted persona as a wealthy Boston trust fund heir was completely stripped away, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell of a man. The federal prosecutors ensured his 25-year sentence offered absolutely no possibility of early parole. He spent his days scrubbing cafeteria floors, a harsh demotion from the luxury suites he used to con his way into. Terrence was incarcerated slightly closer to home at the Federal Correctional Institution in Jessup, Georgia. The former patriarch who once commanded megachurch congregations and dictated the social hierarchy of elite Black Atlanta was now just another inmate wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His expensive tailored suits and gold watches were seized and sold at government auctions. He tried to organize the other inmates into a hierarchy, but his arrogant demands only earned him complete isolation. He spent his recreation time pacing the concrete yard, completely ignored by the men around him. He finally achieved the absolute total separation from his community that he always thought made him superior. Vivian experienced a much different kind of prison. My mother did not end up behind iron bars, but she was firmly trapped in a social purgatory of her own making. The federal government seized every hidden bank account and liquidated her luxury assets to pay back the embezzled charity funds. Left with absolutely nothing, she was forced to take a minimum wage job as a hospitality attendant at a mid-tier hotel near the airport. One Tuesday afternoon, she was assigned to clean the lobby restrooms. As she pushed her heavy plastic janitorial cart out of the service elevator, she locked eyes with a woman walking past the concierge desk. It was the wife of the prominent bishop, the very same woman Vivian used to sip imported champagne with at the country club. My mother froze instinctively, reaching up to smooth her cheap uniform collar, desperate for a flicker of recognition or sympathy. The bishop's wife looked directly at Vivian, staring right through her, as if she were completely invisible. She turned her head and kept walking without breaking her stride. Vivian was entirely erased from the high society she worshipped. She was forced to realize that her wealthy friends never actually cared about her. They only cared about the illusion of perfection she provided, and the second it shattered, she became completely disposable. Jasmine honored the silent agreement we made at the grocery store. She did not call me begging for favors, and she did not try to exploit our fragile connection. She attended her community college finance classes every single morning and worked her cashier shifts every single night without a single complaint. She was slowly, painfully rebuilding her identity from scratch, entirely free from the toxic vanity that almost cost her her life. I watched her progress from a distance, respecting the strict boundaries we established. While my family lived out the agonizing consequences of their profound greed, I focused entirely on cementing my own legacy. I stood in my massive penthouse office on the 50th floor of the Obsidian Capitol skyscraper. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The city stretched out beneath me, a shimmering grid of endless power and opportunity that I now controlled completely. I walked over to my custom marble desk and sat down in my high-backed leather chair. Waiting for me in the center of the desk was a thick stack of legal documents tied with a gold ribbon. It was not a hostile corporate takeover or a distressed debt portfolio. It was the final incorporation paperwork for the Big Mama Foundation. I picked up my favorite heavy gold pen and began signing my name on the dotted lines. I was officially injecting $50 million of my own private capital into the foundation. The grant program was specifically designed to provide emergency housing, extensive mental health therapy, and substantial business seed money exclusively for young Black women who had been scapegoated, disowned, or financially abused by their own toxic families. I was creating the exact financial safety net that I desperately needed when Terrence kicked me out onto the street 10 years ago. I was ensuring that no ambitious, brilliant Black girl would ever have to choose between enduring psychological abuse and facing total financial ruin alone. The foundation board was fully assembled, consisting of powerful, dedicated women who understood the critical importance of absolute financial independence and self-reliance. I signed the final page, sealing the generational wealth back into the hands of the people who actually deserved it. I closed the thick leather folder and pushed it aside. I stood up from my desk and walked slowly toward the massive glass window. I crossed my arms and looked out over the glittering city as the sun began to set, casting vibrant streaks of purple and gold across the southern sky. I thought about the frightened 19-year-old girl crying in the back of a taxicab. I thought about the exhausted woman working 100-hour weeks to build an empire from absolute scratch. I thought about the incredibly satisfying sound of federal handcuffs locking around the wrists of the men who tried to break me. They put me by the trash because they thought I was disposable. They did not realize that when you strip everything away from a woman, you leave her with nothing to lose. I did not just walk out of a wedding that day. I walked straight into my empire. Blackout. The greatest lesson from this story is that blood does not automatically grant someone the right to disrespect you. True wealth is never about projecting a fake image of perfection to impress high society strangers who will abandon you the second you stumble. It is about absolute financial independence and the quiet power of building your own life on a foundation of truth. You must have the courage to walk away from toxic family members who view you as disposable. When you stop seeking the validation of a broken system, you finally gain the ultimate power to build your own unbreakable empire. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace, and hit that subscribe button for more stories of ultimate justice.